flagship engagements. And one is around education, follow-up to the Education Summit. And there's a massive community there who is engaged. A lot of them are young people that are comprised of other different networks. And so there's so much of vigor and opportunity to find in these constituencies in the follow-up to the Education Summit. That, of course, has to be coupled with the technology, with the climate change that will provide other obstacles to learning opportunities for youth. And last thing, and then I'll say just very briefly about human rights. So the point I wanted to make is about the countries that we reach. The promise of the SDGs and the Sustainable Development Agenda was always to reach those furthest behind first. And there is still a group of least developed countries amongst the UN member states. 2/3, I think it's about 30 or 40, somewhere between that. 2/3 of those are in Africa. And opportunities present themselves in countries like Brazil and Egypt and elsewhere that Google and William had just highlighted that they're working with. But it's very important that we don't lose sight of those that are already left behind or in danger of being left behind. But that's a huge question for business as well, how to engage in these markets that are marked by risk and very high lending rates. And then you sort of tipple over into the very big financial gap of $1 trillion just for education or infrastructure. How do you couple that with all of the funding that's needed for climate? So there's a lot of interconnectedness that needs to be tackled. And it's just so important not to lose sight of those left behind. I don't know if I'm running out of time, sir, and I'm sure I am, but I just wanted to say the very most important thing around human rights considerations, in particular for corporates in this context, and that is to really tackle the biggest problems first. So one of the things that I'm sure everyone here is aware of is the risk of greenwashing and sort of engaging in the Sustainable Development Agenda without having really laid out a mapping of your own supply chains and tackling the biggest issues first. So I just want to highlight the importance of human rights due diligence and opening up a possibility of tackling not the main things that your business is working on, but those that are the most salient human rights issues first. And again, the interconnectedness between different human rights violations is important, in particular when you speak about education. Companies can have a very big program and bringing kids back to school, taking them out of family-owned businesses or an informal sector that then will have huge implications for families. And so there's just a big sort of ring of circles in the water that needs to be tackled when you bring in the human rights due diligence process and prioritize the issues at hand.
Thank you, Julie. That human rights perspective is so important to the conversation. We really appreciate it. I want to give Andreas and Drew just a moment, even though we're running out of time, to address it. And I wonder if, one way to phrase the question is if you could ask industry or government or education systems to do something different to address the biggest risks associated with technology use, what would you ask?
Well, I would pick up, where William left. We need to move from a culture of public versus private to a culture of public with private in service of the public. But there's a lot of work that we can do by getting, creating a more level playing field. I think, government as a regulator rather than as a provider, creating that, more innovation-friendly environment. I think that would create huge opportunities for industry, particularly for small enterprises. Now, also, industry and government can work together to identify the opportunities, the kind of guardrails that are required, the kind of constraints that should exist. Again, government has ultimate responsibility for education, but this new education we're talking about is largely about learning, and people will take ownership over what they learn and how they learn and where they learn and when in their lives they learn. So we're moving away from the kind of one-size-fits-all provision to this different environment, and that's where I think a really intensive collaboration of government and industry, not just on the how, the methodology, but also on the what question, I think could be so powerful to move the education agenda forward now.
Thank you. Drew?
So I think the others covered the human rights angle really well. I'll just bring up one area that I think is not in mainstream conversation yet that will be over the next 10 years, which is not just human rights, but AI rights. And it's kind of a sensitive subject to talk about, but whether or not we want to talk about it, people will be talking about it. There's startups now that some of you may know, Character AI and others, where people are falling in love with AI friends and girlfriends and boyfriends. You know, AIs are taking on identities of their own. And I think there's going to be a question here of how do we think about humans? How do we think about AIs? And someone mentioned in the comments here the existential risk of AIs. So as sort of on that tail end risk, there's also going to be this question around what are the rights of those AIs. And I think that's going to be a seismic shift for the community to be thinking about, because our whole world is based on humans. If we think about all the agreements around human rights, I think there's going to be another question here around AI rights.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Drew, and the rest of you. So staying in a little bit in the governance, conversations such as the one we have today, we obviously find important. But what is probably more important is how do we bring these ideas from conversations like this into real life? What are the forums we need? Which policies and practices are actually required to turn such conversations into actions and real life? Who cares to start? Andreas, would you care to?
I didn't get quite that question. Sorry. Maybe I'm not best.
It's simply how do we bring such conversations into real life? How do we ensure that we transition from such conversations into action? What are the policies and the forums we need?
Well, you know, I think the real conversation has to be made by the people who are at the front line. And I think we should start with the students, with the educators, not with the policymakers, really, and to create actually more of a kind of forum where people can actually, our education systems are still designed in a very industrial way, where good ideas, you know, trickle from top down. And we need to just become better to find the good ideas, you know, find better ways to scale and spread them and share them. I really think that is where the conversation is needed. That's where they make a difference. If you do not get, you know, educators into the design of technologies, they're not going to help you with implementation. You cannot. And I think this is where we should really, you know, change the needle. Same for learners. You know, I actually think we underestimate what, you know, students in middle school and high school are capable of doing in terms of, you know, imagining the ways in which they learn best, and to help co-create the kind of learning environments that will help them.
Drew and William, you're both from highly innovative companies. What is your take on this?
Well, I mean, I think I sort of touched on it earlier. I think we need to do more of the kind of work we're doing with the DTC on the public-private partnerships front. But I also agree with Andreas that we need to figure out, and I alluded to this earlier, we need to figure out how to get the voices of the innovative teaching community heard by the rest. You know, I think what I see as I talk to governments around the world is I see inertia. You know, these are large systems, and for the most part, they just kind of carry on as they have been, you know, for the industrial age, right? So, and I think we need to figure out, you know, how to help governments innovate more and take those risks, and that's much easier said than done. But you know, these are, at the end of the day, these are mega programs with mega complexity. Many stakeholders, and time is of the essence, right? So we can't afford to get them wrong. Unfortunately, mega programs have a higher failure rate than normal programs do. So I think we need to get governments to recognize that change management in this context requires a disciplined approach. And unfortunately, what we see just too much kind of shooting from the hip spending, if I can be blunt. You know, without much thought as to what outcome they're trying to affect with that spending. So this is what I spend my time trying to talk to governments about, is getting them to think about what is the outcome you're trying to achieve, and have you thought about it in terms of systemic change, not just spending money on the problem. So
thank you. Drew, final comment, 30 seconds. You're an innovator.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I mean, I think I agree there's a lot of inertia in the system. I think each and every one of us here has our own educational journey. Each and every one of us can go out this week, talk to a student, talk to a teacher, try to understand what's happening on the ground because things are changing. And just trying to think from first principles about what little part of the system we can do to try to make it more equitable. And yeah, I think we can all start there.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much for a really wonderful panel discussion. We've looked at with you and your comments and insights on education. One of the main areas that we are looking at, and the other area that we're looking at is, of course, the financial sector as two important elements for development, and two important areas where we use technology increasingly. So we'll make a swift transition from education to finance,